This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, the editor-in-chief at FanDuel and at NumberFire.com, and this is episode 181 of the Late Round Podcast, one of the many shows that are part of the NumberFire Podcast Network. Thanks for tuning in. Week 7's matchup show is a pretty good one. I talked about Joe Flacco, Baker Mayfield, and Eli Manning all being good plays, and they each came through with top 12 QB1 performances. I liked Marlon Mack, and he was last week's RB2. John Brown had a good game, Corey Davis was bad again, and Josh Gordon hit 100 yards. And I didn't like Carlos Hyde, and he got traded. See what happens on this podcast? It's magical. I missed things too, of course, but even some of the misses weren't egregiously bad. Andrew Luck was someone I was lower on last week, and he threw for 4 touchdowns, but he also had just 156 yards. I don't think the process for saying that he was more of a mid-range QB2 was so off. So overall, it was a pretty good week. Let's hope things continue into week 8. Before digging in, I wanted to let you guys know that with Halloween coming up, we've got a special offer for late round podcast listeners from NumberFire. For a limited time until the end of the day on Halloween, upgrade to NumberFire Premium for only $5. Just use promo code DUNK at checkout and get access to award-winning DFS tools and gambling picks across the NFL and NBA. For more info, visit numberfire.com/premium. That's promo code DUNK. Try it out for a month for only $5 today. Andy Dalton was a huge disappointment in Week 7, but he's in a perfect spot to rebound in Week 8. He's at home, and he's taking on the Buccaneers, who own NumberFire's worst schedule-adjusted secondary. On the season, the only quarterback who hasn't finished as a weekly top 10 one against Tampa Bay has been Nick Foles. He scored 16 fantasy points while throwing for 334 yards. Every other quarterback starter has posted 20 points against the Bucs. Like I said, Dalton's at home in a more comfortable environment, and the Bengals-Bucs game has an over-under of 54, which is one of the higher ones on the slate. He's a really, really good option this week. Some of you might have Matthew Stafford this week, and maybe you don't know what to do with him. On paper, his matchup doesn't look great. Seattle's allowing the third fewest points per game to opposing passers. But take a look at who Seattle's faced this year. Case Keenum, Mitch Trubisky before he started airing it out more, Dak Prescott, Josh Rosen, Jared Goff with 2 of his wide receivers getting knocked out of the game, Derek Carr. Let's not pretend Seattle's seen a very hard schedule. The matchup for Stafford is probably more of an average one rather than a bad one. The good news is that he's playing at home in a domed environment. The Lions are 3-point favorites, and this game actually has a decent over-under that's near 50 points. So I think he's still a higher-end QB2 and worthy of a start during a week where there aren't many good quarterback streamers. One of the 2 quarterbacks that I'm lower on this week that I want to talk about is Deshaun Watson. He's been dealing with lung and rib injuries, and while he's far tougher than I'll ever be for doing something like that, we've also seen his fantasy production dip of late. During the Texans' first 5 games, Watson was averaging 40 rushing yards per game while running the ball almost 7 times per contest. Over his last 2 games, he's run the ball 9 total times for 15 yards. But that's not all for Watson. He's also been throwing it deep less frequently. After the first 3 games of the season, Watson was throwing at 15-plus air yards on 26.4% of his throws. Over his last 4 games, that deep ball rate has been 12.6%. That's almost a 14% drop. Now, 2 things could be at play here. Maybe some of this is due to his injury, but some of it could also be Kiki Cutie, who started playing for Houston in Week 4. Cutie's expected to miss Week 8, which means the deep ball rate could increase more. But that doesn't really change the rushing numbers or the fear that his rib injury is to blame for those lack of deep ball throws. Essentially, there's some worry with Deshaun Watson right now. Even in a decent matchup, I don't think he's an absolute must start. There's a good bit of risk there. Carson Wentz is another quarterback that I don't think that you need to be playing this week. There's a lot of talk about Jacksonville's defense and how they seem to be underperforming a bit, but the secondary is still one of the best in football. And they've been good against opposing fantasy quarterbacks this year as well. Only Dak Prescott has been able to finish higher than QB 17 against them, while Pat Mahomes is the only passer with more than 300 yards against the Jags. There's a low over-under in this contest. It's in London, and the matchup's just not there. You can probably sit Carson Wentz this week. Now, like I said, there aren't many good quarterback streamers in Week 8. I think you could play Derek Carr and Joe Flacco if you absolutely have to stream, but compared to a week like last week, it's not a good one for streamers. If you need a super deep play, Josh Rosen is a name to at least throw out there, but I can't imagine a scenario in a typical league where you need to start Josh Rosen. Hopefully you're able to just play someone like Dalton and get production at the position this week. I talked about Marlon Mack in week 7, and he came through big time. And you can't be benching him this week against Oakland. The thing you have to worry about with Mack, aside from his hamstring, is a negative game script. We saw 2 weeks ago against the Jets how the Colts will deploy Nyheim Hines in those situations when Marlon Mack played just 35% of the team's snaps. But this past week, we saw that there's plenty of volume to be had in a positive script. And that's what he could end up seeing this week as a road favorite. Even if the Colts fall behind, his touches should be valuable ones, with Oakland ranking 5th worst in rush defense efficiency according to NumberFire's expected points model. It's a great spot for Marlon Mack, and to me, he's a fringe RB1 here in week 8. Opposite of Mack in that game is Jalen Richard, who's another running back that I like a lot this week. Doug Martin should take a lot of Marshawn Lynch's work, who's now sidelined. But Jalen Richard does have some opportunity to at least steal some of that. And even if he doesn't, the lack of pass catchers in that offense and the potential for a negative game script really plays into Jalen Richard's favor. On the season, even with a healthy Marshawn Lynch, Jalen Richard has a near 16% target share in Oakland's offense. Over the last 2 games combined, Jalen Richard is the leader in targets in Oakland. Now there's no Amari Cooper, the potential for the negative game script is there, like I said, and the matchup is also there. Indianapolis has allowed the second most receptions to running backs this year. If Richard can grab hold of some of Lynch's work, which again, that's not really what we're banking on here, but if he can get additional work, he's got a lot of potential in this particular matchup. Another fringe starter that you could consider starting this week is Chris Carson. He's seen 65 carries over the Seahawks' last 3 games, and Detroit's been really bad against the run. The Lions did just get Snacks Harrison, but there's no telling how big of an impact he'll have on a new team after being traded on a Wednesday. So I think Carson is still viable. Detroit ranks dead last in expected points allowed per play to running backs, and they're 31st in success rate allowed, giving up a 48.1% rate to opposing backs. It's a defense that you can run on, and Carson shouldn't have that much trouble. After looking at Fantasy Pros and seeing where analysts are ranking guys this week, I was surprised to see how low Kenyon Barner was. Maybe it's because Sony Michel hasn't officially been rolled out, but it sounds like he's not going to play this week. So enter Barner, who ran the ball 10 times last Sunday with a 27% snap share. He's competing for touches primarily with James White, who's hit double-digit carries just twice in his 54-game career, with one of those games happening this past week. James White isn't exactly a high workload back, so that could lead to a ton of work for Barner. And in a game where New England could see a pretty big lead as 14-point favorites, that's especially true. I love Phillip Lindsay, and I'm all about him in fantasy football. I recommend you play him many times on this podcast this season. But I was shocked to see him ranked as RB10 this week over on Fantasy Pros. It's not because I don't see that in his range of outcomes. I absolutely do. But Kansas City hasn't been as bad defensively at home this year, and that's definitely the case against opposing running backs. Now, overall, KC is arguably the best matchup for a running back. Don't take this as me saying this isn't a good matchup. It's not bad, especially given they're 28th in the league in success rate allowed to opposing backs through the air. But they held the Jags to 67 yards rushing in Kansas City back in week 5, and Joe Mixon had just 50 yards on the ground this past week. You might say, well, that's because they were in negative game scripts, but that's sort of the point. In order for Lindsay to come through as an RB1 this week, he's got to more than likely be heavily involved in the passing game. We know he's a capable pass catcher, but he's also seen more than 3 targets just twice this year, including just 2 targets against the same Chiefs team back in week 4. And I know what you're thinking, but Royce Freeman could be sidelined. And you're not wrong. There's been mostly a 3-way backfield split from a snap standpoint between Freeman, Lindsay, and Devontae Booker this year, so if Freeman's out, we'd see closer to a 50-50 split, which would help Lindsay. But an RB1 ranking is already playing into that. Lindsay's actually never even finished a week as an RB1 this year. So I like Lindsay this week, and he should be fine in your lineup. But I don't think he has more upside or a higher floor than someone like Marlon Mack or Mark Ingram. Because there's also a scenario where Denver doesn't score a ton of points because the offense isn't very good, which will limit Lindsay's touchdown potential. I sort of feel like people are too optimistic when it comes to Kenyon Drake, too. There's obviously the chance that he plays more of a pass-catching role with the injuries to Kenny Stills and Albert Wilson in that offense, but as strictly a runner, he's facing one of the toughest matchups in football this week. Houston ranks 2nd in rushing efficiency allowed and 4th in success rate allowed according to NumberFire, and they've given up the 8th lowest success rate to opposing running backs through the air as well. With Frank Gore continuing to out-attempt Drake, I have a hard time seeing him as the RB2 that he's being ranked as. He's still a high-risk, high-reward flex play to me. There's just too much going up against him each week. At wide receiver this week, I love Tyler Boyd to also bounce back. I talked about Dalton earlier facing NumberFire's lowest ranked secondary, and obviously Tyler Boyd gets that matchup as well. He's averaging 8 targets per game this year, and he's got a 21.4% target share. Those are both good numbers. But he'll also see a nice matchup in the slot. Boyd's played 70.5% of his snaps from the slot this season, which is the highest on the Bengals according to Pro Football Focus. And when he's there, he'll see MJ Stewart, who's allowing the most yards per snap in the slot this season among relevant corners, and he's one of 2 slot cornerbacks who have allowed 4 touchdowns this year. And remember, the Bucs have had their bye. They've only played 6 games. So Boyd, to me, is an awesome play this week, and he should be in your lineup despite his mediocre Week 7 outing. Not that you're necessarily benching him, but T.Y. Hilton is in a great position to score points this week too. We know Hilton is a big play threat, and Oakland this season has allowed a 9.6 average depth of target, which is second highest in the NFL. Only Pittsburgh has given up a higher ADOT. Hilton only saw 4 targets last week, but Andrew Luck also only threw 23 passes. That 17.4% target share is fine for a guy who is coming off an injury. I wouldn't be shocked at all if Hilton ends this week as a wide receiver 1, especially if Oakland's offense looks competent against Indy's defense. Okay, so Boyd and Hilton were more wide receiver 2 plays who I like a little bit more than consensus. Let's dig a little bit deeper. One deeper play that you could look at is Traquan Smith against Minnesota. With Ted Ginn now on IR, Smith stepped in and played over 73% of New Orleans snaps this past weekend. He wasn't overly productive in Week 7, but he was also facing a really good Baltimore secondary, and he saw 6 of a possible 30 Drew Brees targets. That's good for a 20% target share. That's really strong in a New Orleans offense. This week, the matchup is a little bit better. They're playing in a dome, and the game has a 53-point over-under. If Traquan sees a similar target share and snap rate, his production should only increase. There's also Danny Amendola, who's available on a lot of waiver wires at the time of this recording. He's been limited in practice this week, but it sounds like it's more of a precaution because the Dolphins are without Kenny Stills and Albert Wilson. And that's really why Amendola is being brought up here. Miami doesn't have much from a wide receiver standpoint in that offense that's healthy right now. With Houston's secondary being more beatable than their front 7, and with Miami likely to see a negative game script, there could be a decent amount of passes thrown from Brock Osweiler on Thursday night. Amendola then could benefit from that volume. Plus, it's a Brock Osweiler revenge game, so that's pretty fun. As I mentioned before, Baltimore's secondary is really good. They rank 5th best in points per game allowed to the wide receiver position, and they're 2nd in schedule-adjusted pass defense per number fire. So Devin Funchess, who's coming off back-to-back 18-point PPR performances, is a risky play here in Week 8. He's seen 19 targets over his last 2 games, but keep in mind that Cam Newton has thrown the ball an average of almost 40 times per game during those 2 contests. His season-long average outside of Weeks 6 and 7 is 32.5 attempts per game. Now don't get me wrong, Funchess' target share is still really impressive. But the Panthers are now playing at home after being away, and in Charlotte this year, Newton's thrown it 26 or fewer times in 2 of his 3 games. So even if Funchess somehow maintains his 24% target share, it may be 24% of just 25 to 30 attempts. That equates to about 7 targets. And those are 7 targets against a really good secondary. So I'm not a huge fan of Devin Funchess this week. I also want to note that you can't play any Jacksonville wide receiver right now. Not only is there inconsistency week to week with which one to start, but the trio of guys, so I'm talking about Dante Moncrief, Dede Westbrook, and Keelan Cole, each have just 1 top 20 performance this season. So even though the matchup isn't the worst, given that Philly's allowing the 5th most points to the position per game this year, it's just hard to trust this passing attack with Blake Bortles playing like a hot pile of trash. At tight end this week, I've got 2 streamers for you, or at least 1 borderline streamer and 1 definite streamer. We'll start with the borderline streamer. I keep talking about a Bengals passing game bounce back, and CJ Uzomah could be a big part of that. The Buccaneers have now allowed a top 6 performance, so a high-end tight end 1 performance, in each of their last 5 games. And their only other contest this year, they gave up a tight end 11 performance. Now, their competition hasn't been that bad, but that's still pretty incredible. So enter CJ Uzomah, who's run the 4th most routes at the tight end position across the league over the last 2 weeks, while playing as Cincinnati's lead tight end. He's a great play in Week 8. A sleeper tight end this week is Jeff Hireman. Yes, Jeff freaking Hireman. He actually ranks in the top 15 in routes run at tight end over the last 2 weeks, and the last time Denver faced Kansas City, he saw a season-high 7 targets. KC this season has allowed the most yards to the tight end position, and they're top 10 in football in receptions allowed to tight ends. And Denver should be forced to throw against the Chiefs as big underdogs. That's been the case for most teams this year against Kansas City, considering KC has faced the most passes in the league this season. So Hireman is an interesting deep option for desperate fantasy managers this week. I've talked about a couple of Denver players on today's show, but I do like Kansas City's defense as a streamer. Like I said earlier, the Chiefs have been a lot better at home than on the road this year defensively. At home, they've scored 4, 22, and 14 points as a fantasy defense. On the road, they've posted 10, -3, 6, and 0 points. In their 3 home games, they've tallied 11 sacks. That's definitely helped their performances. But Denver's given up at least 1 sack and 1 interception in every game that they've played this year. They haven't really provided a huge ceiling for a defense, but they're giving away a nice floor. As big favorites, Kansas City is not a bad streamer. But one streamer I like more is Pittsburgh. They're at home as a favorite, which is always what you look for in a defensive play off the waiver wire. But more importantly, Cleveland's allowing the most sacks in the league this season, while Pittsburgh is second best in football in sacks per game on the defensive side. Baker Mayfield could go down a lot in this game, and that makes Pittsburgh a really good play. That's going to do it for today's show, though. Thanks to everyone for listening. If you've yet to subscribe to the Late Round Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it on iTunes, Google Play, SoundCloud, TuneIn, and Stitcher. And make sure you're following my awful takes on Twitter @LateRoundQB. Thanks, everyone. I'll talk to you tomorrow with the mailbag episode.